Miley worked as a primary care physician in a small mountain hospital. Despite the modest size of the facility, there was no shortage of responsibilities as the town where it was located was incredibly popular among tourists. Miley was frequently tasked with visiting patients in their homes. This was mainly due to the continuous shortage of nurses who could perform tasks such as changing dressings, administering injections, or replacing catheters for patients who, despite being seriously ill, chose to remain at home. Unfortunately, the remote location and average salary did not attract nurses from larger cities to take up employment at the hospital where Miley worked. One summer morning, just as Miley was about to finish her night shift, an ambulance arrived on the premises. As she stepped out to receive the patient, she froze in her tracks. Standing in the doorway was Christian, a man she would never have wanted to see again. For a moment, she was speechless, and her hands began to tremble, barely able to hold the documents. Christian quickly picked them up from the floor and provided information about the patient, a young boy who had unfortunately slipped on a trail and likely broken his leg. Miley swiftly took charge of the patient, trying her best to avoid making eye contact with Christian. After the procedure, Miley went to the nurse's room to provide instructions for the care of the newly admitted patient. The nurses were engrossed in discussing the new ambulance team. They were captivated by the charm of the new paramedic, Christian. They couldn't stop praising his charisma and wondered which one of them would be able to win him over. Miley couldn't bear to listen to that. The immense sorrow and disappointment she felt towards Christian, who had once disappeared from her life without a word, came flooding back with full force. In the afternoon, Miley went to see her friend Annetta. She needed to talk and release her emotions. She decided to stop by the supermarket beforehand to buy wine, perhaps even 3 bottles. She felt that the evening would be difficult, and she needed something to help her relax. She was already at the checkout when she suddenly heard a familiar voice. She turned around. It was Christian. In haste, he ended his phone call and greeted Miley with a wide smile. "You haven't changed much. I see you still like to make an impression," he said, glancing at her purchases. Miley felt her cheeks flush. She asked him how long he planned to stay. When she heard the answer, she regretted asking the question. She quickly bid him farewell, mentioning that her friends were waiting for her, and literally rushed out of the store. As soon as Annetta opened the door, Miley exclaimed from the threshold, "He's back. And he claims he's staying for good." It took a few moments and a hurried glass of wine for her to explain to Annetta what was going on. Her friend learned that Miley's former, albeit brief, love had returned to town. Christian had come back because his father's health had significantly deteriorated and he needed care. Annetta tried to console her friend, but even though their brief romance took place almost 8 years ago, she could see that Miley still loved him. Unfortunately, Miley couldn't do anything about it. She had to accept that from now on, she would constantly come across Christian at work. However, she decided to stay strong and keep him at a distance, even though with age, he had become even more handsome and alluring. For the next week, she managed to only catch fleeting glimpses of Christian, and luckily, they were never alone. However, one evening, as Miley was leaving the hospital, she met Christian in the courtyard. He suggested that since they were both free, they could grab a bite to eat, as he wanted to find out what was happening in their town after 8 years of absence. Miley tried to resist, but so clumsily that before she realized it, she was already sitting in Christian's car. During dinner, she tried not to show her nervousness. After all, she remembered that Christian had always been a charming man and an interesting conversationalist. For a moment, she even forgot her resentment towards him. They mainly talked about what had changed in their town over those 8 years and what had remained constant. During their conversation, Miley was struck by the fact that Christian talked about his past 5 years, how he became a paramedic, and how he was completing his anesthesiology training, which meant that they would probably be seeing more of each other in the hospital. Miley was almost certain that he intentionally omitted the first 3 years after leaving, just to avoid a topic he didn't want to discuss, how he left her without any explanation and never called once. Despite the bitter memories, she had to admit that their dinner was pleasant. Afterward, Christian insisted that he wouldn't let her return home alone. Miley knew there was no point in resisting because Christian had always been persistent and couldn't be easily dismissed. However, he didn't drop Miley off at her house. Instead, he decided that it was such a beautiful and warm evening that it would be a shame not to take a walk. He parked the car by the riverbank, took Miley's hand, and said that the 2 km walk to her house would do them good. Miley was surprised, but had no desire to refuse him. She didn't understand what was happening to her. She was supposed to keep him at a distance, yet here she was, walking hand in hand with him by the riverbank in the moonlight. When she stumbled, Christian's quick reflexes prevented her from falling into the river. He pulled her towards him, embraced her at the waist, and kissed her passionately. Miley was initially in shock, but memories flooded back, and she succumbed to the moment. Suddenly, however, she regained her composure and pushed him away. Christian claimed that as soon as he saw her at the hospital, he felt drawn to her and assumed she must have felt the same since she reciprocated the kiss. Miley, embarrassed, said it was a mistake. They were and would always be just colleagues at work, and she didn't want anything like that to ever happen again. As they arrived at Miley's home, she bid him a cold farewell, but Christian didn't lose his sense of humor and remarked that he could use another cup of tea. Miley's sharp gaze prompted him to quickly say it was just a joke, but that he couldn't wait for their next dinner together. Miley couldn't sleep. She was furious with herself for getting carried away in the moment and returning his kiss. 2 weeks passed, and Miley managed to avoid Christian whenever she could. One afternoon, Miley received a phone call. She had to go to a patient who had fallen at home and likely broken their leg. The ambulance was occupied with another call. Miley quickly packed her medical bag and headed out. To her horror, she realized that the address was Christian's house. When she arrived, there was no response to her knocking on the door. Worried, Miley entered. In the living room, she saw Christian's father and the neighbor, who was applying cold compresses to a severely swollen leg. Miley stabilized the patient's leg, and in the meantime, the neighbor's husband arrived to help transport the patient to her car. Miley decided that she would personally drive the patient to the hospital due to the uncertainty of how long they would have to wait for an ambulance. Christian's father could not help but praise his son during the drive, despite living in discord and estrangement. He forgave him and decided that he would take care of him in his old age. Miley knew about Christian's anger towards his father, stemming from his infidelity and the breakdown of their family. As a result, Christian's mother moved to a distant city, and in a gesture of solidarity, he followed her. These memories brought back one of Christian's visits to their hometown, when they both drank too much at a party hosted by a mutual friend and spent a passionate night together. Miley wasn't proud of it, but it turned out that Christian wasn't the type of man who took advantage of women. On the contrary, the next day, he told her that he had noticed her for a long time and wanted to go out with her. Later, he made the journey twice more to spend time with Miley, stating that he took it seriously. During their conversation, Christian's father mentioned a great tragedy that had befallen his son, and for over a year, he had feared for Christian's life. Miley couldn't comprehend it, and Christian's father was already under the influence of strong medication, so he could have been mistaken. When they arrived at the hospital, Christian burst into the room, visibly anxious. Miley felt his concern for his father, with whom he had cut off contact for almost 8 years. A smile appeared on her face, seeing how Christian cared for his father. Involuntarily, she embraced him, trying to calm him down. She assured him that his father would fully recover from the fracture, but her words seemed to not reach him. Surprised by her gesture, Christian fell silent for a moment, then pulled her closer. Christian thanked her for her care and hurried to his father. His father's words about the possibility of Christian's absence kept resonating in Miley's mind. In the evening, Christian waited for Miley outside the hospital, and as soon as she came out, he declared that as a thank you for taking care of his father, he would take her out to dinner and wouldn't accept any refusal. Miley had to admit that they had a good time together. They talked, laughed. She felt a strong tension between them. She felt that Christian was seducing her, and she struggled to resist him. However, she remembered how he treated her years ago, how he used her, and now, as if nothing had happened, he was doing it again without any remorse. He didn't even think about explaining his previous behavior. She was sure she wouldn't step into the same river twice, especially since she suffered greatly because of him in the past. This time, Christian drove Miley all the way to her doorstep and thanked her for her caring for his father. Unexpectedly, he became emotional and said that he was terrified when he heard that his father had been admitted to the hospital. His mother had passed away just 6 months ago, and even though he had resented his father for such a long time, he wouldn't bear losing him now. Miley forgot all about her decision to keep her distance from Christian. She embraced him and started kissing his cheeks, and then they passionately kissed each other. Miley lost herself in the moment. After all, she still loved him. However, at one point, Christian pushed her away and said that he wasn't the kind of man who takes advantage of any situation to take advantage of a girl. At that moment, Miley got furious. "You don't take advantage of girls?" After all, he used her and then abandoned her without a word. She channeled all her anger into delivering a resounding slap across Christian's face, then slammed the door in his face. Christian was shocked, but decided that this wasn't the best moment to explain the situation. The next day, Miley met with Annette and told her everything that had happened, mentioning that Christian's father had mentioned a great tragedy. Annette said that her friend was dating an old close acquaintance of Christian's, so she would try to find out if he knew anything about the situation. 2 days later, as Miley sat at home in the evening, struggling with her thoughts, someone knocked on the door. Standing at the door was Annette. Miley was terrified, wondering what could have happened that Annette came to her personally at such a late hour. Annette said that she had news about Christian, but it wasn't something to discuss over the phone, so she came to tell her in person. Annette revealed that almost 8 years ago, when Christian was returning to his mother after visiting Miley, he had a serious accident, so severe that he was in a coma for over a year. At the beginning, the prognosis was the worst, giving him only a few weeks to live. After over a year, he woke up, and then spent another year recovering. Annette stated that in light of what she had learned, Miley should meet with Christian and tell him about their past relationship and the tragedy that had also befallen her. Miley was overwhelmed with emotions. She called Christian. Sleepy, Christian answered, and Miley apologized for the late hour but explained that the past was haunting her and they needed to talk as soon as possible. Shocked and frightened by the call from Miley, Christian replied that he would gather himself and be there within about 30 minutes. Miley wondered if she should really tell him everything. She decided to see how the conversation would unfold. Christian arrived, visibly concerned. The phone call from Miley had worried him that something terrible had happened. However, Miley reassured him, stating that since they were going to work and live together, they needed to talk now. Still at the door, she asked Christian what he was doing 5 years ago. Christian admitted that he couldn't remember because he had an accident back then. He didn't understand why Miley was digging into his past, especially since she treated him like her worst enemy on a daily basis. Miley concluded that since a longer conversation was imminent, Christian should come inside. She poured him a glass of wine. She had already had two herself. She told him that 8 years ago, they started seeing each other and were together. It was 3 meetings, but intense, and back then, he claimed that he wanted to spend his whole life with her. Unfortunately, after the 3rd meeting, he literally disappeared without a word of explanation. Miley couldn't contact him, his number was out of reach, and she had no contact with his mother. Surprised, Christian drank the glass of wine in one gulp. He said that now he understood why. Ever since he saw her in the hospital, he felt an irresistible force pulling him towards her. And on top of that, Miley treated him so hostilely. He revealed that he had an accident, was in a coma, didn't remember anything from that period, and the accident caused him retrograde amnesia. He only knew that he was deeply attracted to Miley and drawn to her. If it were possible and she could forget about the past, he would like to try building something lasting with her. Miley confessed that she was pregnant with him. Unfortunately, she miscarried. It was the main reason she had such immense resentment towards him. He left her alone with the pain, not only caused by his sudden abandonment, but also because she lost the baby. However, now she knew that all of this was a series of unfortunate, even tragic events. When Christian heard about the child, he burst into tears. Miley was also crying. They comforted each other in their embrace. They talked for a while longer, and they decided that since they both felt drawn to each other and felt something more, maybe they were meant for each other despite all the obstacles. Holding each other, they fell asleep. They woke up at 4 o'clock. They had to be at work by 6. Miley said she would freshen up, and in the meantime, Christian could prepare something for breakfast, and then he could take a shower. As Miley disappeared behind the glass shower doors, Christian felt a pulsating tension that concentrated in every cell of his body. He followed her, opening the shower door, which closed behind him, enveloping them in hot steam. Water cascaded over Miley, giving her skin a glistening sheen that caught his gaze. Christian couldn't contain the passion that was boiling within him. He pulled her closer, and their bodies met, entwined amidst the warm droplets of water. His lips found their way to her neck, planting gentle kisses there, trailing down to her collarbone. Miley tilted her head, surrendering to him, breathing deeper with each passing moment. Christian, his hands exploring her body, slid downward, reaching her waist, drawing her even closer to him. Their lips met in a hot, passionate kiss, filled with desire and longing that had remained unspoken for so many years. Christian moved his hand along her back, pulling her even closer, and their bodies intertwined to the rhythm of their beating hearts. The hot steam enveloped them, accentuating their tension and sensuality in that moment. Their breaths became one, and the whole outside world disappeared. All that existed was them, their bodies, their desires, their feelings. In that moment, everything else ceased to exist. They lost themselves in each other, confessing their love. When the passion subsided, they remained in the shower, breathing quietly, feeling the water cascading over them, washing away years of loneliness and resentment. Miley and Christian gazed into each other's eyes, their looks speaking volumes more than thousands of words. Miley realized that it made no sense to live in the past. She had to live in the here and now, and right now, she wanted Christian more than anything in the world. Christian also felt that he was in the best place he could ever be.